Call our meeting order again. Did you say the first two pages are the same? Rest of it is?
There's one figure changed on the first two pages, and the rest are just new pages to some interesting figures we put together. Okay, let's call this meeting of the Finance Committee to order. Welcome to the school committee. Welcome to the select board. This is we're nearing the end of the budget season, and Finance Committee has had a number of discussions about the budget, and when we started looking at the budget of the town and budget for the schools and so on, we really came to the realization that this year may be the time to start thinking about what is the real issue in town, what we think is the real issue in town, and that is what's going to happen with the schools, the school system as a whole. We came to this by looking at the high school and asking ourselves, what are the chances that the taxpayers in town would vote enough property tax increase to replace the high school? And our conclusion is that that won't happen. That when it was looked at a few years ago, the cost was just so expensive, and even if the school is much smaller now than it would have been then, it's hard to imagine that the taxpayers would actually vote a tax increase to build a new school. So we asked about renovation, and the situation with renovation is that according to the Mass law, we all know that once you renovate a school past a certain percentage of its value, the schools, the MSBA won't let you do that. You'll have to actually bring the entire thing up to code. You can't just fix what you think is wrong. You have to actually change the entire school system, change the entire school building so it comes up to the current code for current new buildings. Then, of course, we realized that we're not the ones who should be dealing with this question, which is the Finance Committee. This is a town-wide matter of what we're going to be doing for educating the children. And what we're worried about is this. We keep saying, well, should we spend this much extra money on the schools or spend that much extra money on the schools? But we've got some figures that lead us to believe that if we keep spending extra money on the schools, we're going to run out of money. I'll show you some figures there. And more importantly than that is that what happens if something bad happens to the high school all at once? And we know that the high school would probably go a few more years with its problems before it becomes unusable. But at some point it's going to be unusable, and it could in fact happen almost overnight. The specter, which we're not saying is going to happen, but the specter that you always have to keep in mind is that the building inspector could one day walk in the front door of the school and say, this building is not safe, or this building is hazardous, or this building has got some problems that we can't use it anymore. And rather than that happen all of a sudden, we wonder whether or not the town would be better off to have a group of people take a look at the question of what is it we're going to do. And if that solution is involving buildings or temporary classrooms or whatever, they'll be able to figure that out and come up with the cost. If that solution is to find some way to have a joint education process with some other city or town, that group should be able to figure that out. But we know that if we just proceed along the same path, we're convinced this whole thing's going to blow up in our face. So,
John, are you guys aware of some building issues that we're not aware of?
well, actually, we're going to ask you the same question, because we have the only thing that we can find online on either the school website or the town website, or even from the MSBA, which MSBA usually only puts on positive things. They usually only put on results about projects that they've approved and so forth. Is the SOI dating back to 2011, and I put it there for your use. It's not the whole thing. The whole thing, as you know, is a very thick document, and everybody probably has a copy of it. Or you can get a copy of it easily enough. But it's just got some alarming statements on there. If, for example, on page 1, the following priorities have included the statement of interest. And the first one is an alarming statement. And on page 7, provide a detailed description of the perceived health and safety problems below, and there's a whole list of things there. On page 16, priority 7, a detailed examine the impact of the problem described in the educational program. So these are official documents which were turned in to the state. So one thing we're kind of interested in is, has there been any update? Has there been any statement of interest sent into the state since this thing was published? Because we don't know.
Yeah, so a follow-up question then. When was the last time we talked about a school building project around the high schools?
It was before.
When was the last project?
It was before this.
How far apart are they?
3 years, maybe.
Yeah, it's actually 1 year apart. We voted the other one down in 2010. So
Voted the statement of interest down?
Not the statement of interest, or the project.
Yeah, the project,
The
right.
same project that we voted down,
Right.
the town voted down, had similar concerns.
Right,
That's why there was a project for the high school, right?
right.
So, what was the finance committee's recommendation at the time?
The finance committee recommendation at the time was.
Because I have your statement from the town meeting, just let's read it together, or
Yep.
you tell us.
No, go ahead and read it.
No, go ahead.
Well, what the finance committee said was that, first of all, we loved the design of the building. We thought it was a fantastic design. And a lot of time and effort went into it, but that the cost was just going to be prohibitive, particularly because, remember this, when that project was put together, statements of interest were put together for the 3 schools, West Street, East Meadow, and the high school. And if you read those statements of interest, what it said was that West Street was in the worst condition of the 3 buildings. Nevertheless, they were not the number 1 priority for the MSBA. The number 1 priority was the high school. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that the cost of it kept escalating. And there was at one point there where we believe the Selectboard asked the building committee to try to keep the cost of under a 10% increase in taxes.
That was actually you, but.
No.
And then Mary and I got to, can I
I wasn't
just
on
interrupt for a minute? Why are we talking about this at all?
We're talking about this because money is being asked for the high school, for the school department, for the budget. And
We didn't ask for it on
Well-
the article, on the town article that's going on the town floor.
money is going to be asked from the school committee for budgets for the schools for this year.
No, I
But
understand that,
we-
but
we're
it's
not here on
relevant.
hypothetical warrants that may or may not happen. It will happen. Every building in this town, every building in every town will require maintenance, will require repairs. And we're gonna go to the town or come to you or to the select board when that happens. We actually came here to continue our conversation around the budget. I see that the budget conversation is number 2 with a lengthy introduction with the condition of our high school. We can have that. I think with the participation of the remainder of your committee, we had a very nice conversation where we agreed, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, that there are 2 paths. One is a short term, one is a long term. This can be discussed under that long term path, and that will be awesome to actually continue this conversation. But a few days before the town meeting and a couple of days before we're going to be voting to approve. And the only reason why we did not approve our budget last week is because you called this meeting, and we appreciate it, and we thought this was a continuation of that conversation around the budget, not a conversation around the condition of the high school. Which, again, later on we can pick it up, but it's not the priority today.
Well, it certainly is, and here's why. The Finance Committee is charged with the responsibility of making a recommendation on every issue that files money that comes before the town. And in short, the issues around the budget for the school system for next year are liable to be, do we recommend minimum net school spending? Do we recommend minimum net school spending plus the $305,000 override? Or do we recommend minimum net school spending plus the $305,000 override plus some other additional figure? And where is the spending going to come from? Now, if we are, once again, after all these years, ignoring the fact that when the high school becomes unusable, we are not in fact going to be able to replace it or even rebuild it. And if we ignore that, then we could have this conversation and ignore that entirely. But if we don't believe that that's the case, then we're very much concerned about taking money from stabilization funds, free cash, or anything else in the short term, because a day of not a planned change, but unplanned change is going to be coming much sooner than we thought.
So we're talking about, we can't take $200,000 out of stabilization because we might have an eventual $40 million project? I think the $200,000 is a drop in the hat.
No, actually, we could take about 3.8 million out of stabilization funds and give it to the schools this year. Okay, and then the problem will occur next year for a different reason. That is not what the question is to us.
Well, it's definitely not the question. It just seems bizarre to me that we're discussing this right now.
My concern is, it's been said a couple of times, talking about the high school, that, in a few years it won't be usable. I don't think that's a fair statement. We don't have where's the facts?
Read the document.
I know, but someone's gone in and has done an inspection of the high school and what needs to be updated. If over the years, maintenance has been done like it should be done on these buildings, you wouldn't have the problem you have right now. I don't see why, throwing it out there saying that the high school won't be usable in 3 years or down the road, we don't know that.
We don't know how long. We don't know it's going to be. If everybody knew it was 2 or 3 years, this would be an easy
Then
process.
that's why we have someone to look at it, and let's figure out where we are as far as the high school. What, as a building, where does it stand? Is there things that we need to bring up to date and stuff like that? Let's look at that. But I just hear people throwing out like, well, it won't be unusable in a few years. So people at home are hearing this saying, what's wrong with the high school? Is it falling apart?
Well, that was one of the questions we asked about whether or not there was a more recent SOI handed into the state for any other reason. The issue is that these things, to the extent, and some of them there has been work done on some of these things, but the problem is that we cannot just fix the problems that are there, because, and that question is asked every year at town meeting, it seems like, because the law says that once you try fixing more than a certain percentage of the value of the building, you can't just fix those
I
things.
understand that, John, but are we there? Are we at those numbers? Are
Well,
we
we're
just
not-
tossing numbers out there? Is that X amount of thousands of $1,000s away, or?
There could be a
That's what I'm asking.
hypothetical
Right.
building inspector that does a hostile takeover of our high school and says that, oh my God, you gotta get out of here now before it's too late, and then that presumes that the state won't have any say in that helping us out. It's just, you can borrow things from the future, but this is going too far.
At the risk of making it sound like the finance committee doesn't speak monolithically, I'm going to say that I think part of the frustration and why this issue is here, and John's talking about it, is there's this disconnect in the discussions about school, and has been going on in this town ever since I've been involved. There's long-run discussions and short-run discussions, and as Emery's pointing out, they blur together, right? We talk about short-run things, and they bleed into long-run things, and so on. So the high school project, when I first was on the finance committee a decade ago, this was the big project. There was all the alarmism. The alarmism then was coming from the school committee, and I spent all the time then saying there was no need for all the alarmism about the school. We weren't going to lose accreditation. The building could be patched up and repaired and continue to operate. I think the same is true now, right? But what's hard in the discussion is a school committee 10 years ago saying all these things are true. John pulls up the documents. Is this still true? Was it not true then? And I guess I'm with you, right? I think the building is fine, and it'll continue to operate. These are big buildings. We can keep them running for a long time. But if we want to do that, we've got to stop with the rhetoric of school collapses and things like that. And then that's the alarmism rhetoric that sort of just gets in the way all the time. Because there's not a long-run plan for the schools that we can tell, I can tell, I'll speak personally, I can't tell what the long-run vision is here yet, because we're always talking about the next budget cycle. And this is very common in things. Mount Holyoke does the same thing, drives me nuts over there, right? The administrators really can't stand me either, right? Because I'm constantly asking, okay, we can talk about next year's budget, but what's the long-run plan here? And the lack of the long-run plan then bleeds over into all the short-run plans, and then how do you fund the short-run plans, and what are we doing? So the frustration, I feel here is, we are late in a budget cycle. I mean, there's a town meeting next week. We're finally sitting down to start talking about a school budget, right? If this conversation had all been able to happen in October of sort of what are the plans looking forward to this point, this sort of could have spread out, but it's hard, I get it. It's hard to do that kind of planning because the funding sources are irregular and so on. But if all we ever do is talk about the next budget cycle, the next budget cycle, the next budget cycle, then these other looming questions never do actually get talked about. And if they never do actually get talked about, then when do we ever have those conversations?
I would
So-
suggest that, I'm not gonna be here, so it's not gonna, nothing I can say will be binding. But it's not that this is necessarily a bad question. It's just, this is just not really, I don't think it's an appropriate time. We're way too late in the budget. We've already had 2 meetings. We've probably already spent about 4 hours, 4.5 hours between the 3 of our committees. And I don't know, we've already been going for 25 minutes on something, and at this rate,
I agree with you, Mark, and I will be here. And I think the school budget right now, I think is what's on the front burner. And not to say this isn't important, but can we take care of what the priority is right now? And then a month from now, I think we get back together and talk about, these are serious things. And then we can start about talking about how do we, protect the building for years, or we don't worry about things. What is the future plans for the schools and stuff like that? Have a project plan for 10 years, 20 years. A lot of businesses do it, a lot of, state agencies do it as well. I mean, we definitely, that's something we do need. I feel we do need that, but.
Well, let me then switch to some of the short-term issues. How much, over the last few years, how much have you requested of the Capital Improvement Committee? How much projects have you requested approved Capital Improvement Committee?
The last few years, I don't know, John's here, maybe he would know, but nothing big because our capital plan was postponed, the review of it, because we had the school building project. So we did not really have major conversations. This is the first time in 3 years that roof is being discussed. So if that's your question, that's the answer. Over the decade, I don't know how many times the schools came in, but we can certainly find that number.
Has the school committee or the superintendent submitted any requests to the MSBA program for
Last year,
Accelerated.
yes, we did.
accelerated
Yes,
program?
accelerated repair program, so that we could mitigate part of the
And what did they
cost.
say?
They did not, they told us we were not qualified for it.
Why are we qualified for it?
Because,
It was relative to the need. It was not just the roof or the window, combination of the roof plus the ventilation system and the heating system.
What do you mean, that made the project ineligible? Did you ask for just the roof?
No, we asked for roof and windows.
Did you go back and ask for
boiler?
just the roof?
No.
you have
They
to go
s-
back into the pipeline. You can't
Right,
just-
and they
it's not
said
a
that they would
negotiation.
not separate out the roof only for accelerated repair.
do you have any suggestions? Because I remember last year we had a conversation and you, I believe you mentioned that we should not have gone to an SBA. You should have gone through the Selectboard and we did not do the right thing. So I'm kind of getting confused with all these things that are being rehashed and just brought with regards to the buildings. Again, we have no problem discussing the buildings and they're going to be important for the future of the district. That's true. What puzzles me really that any conversation that we have about the future starts from a place of catastrophe. Things are going to fall apart. Something is coming. Things, unexpectedly may disappear. What are we going to do? What I would like to do, and I hope that, Rob, I was going to put you on the spot last time, but we can have that long-term conversation. Any long-term planning should start from a positive spot to say, what can we do to make things better? Not, things are going to fall apart and disappear, and how do we prepare for that, calamity, the end of the day. So I think that's where I'm getting puzzled. Otherwise, these are, as Mark said, good conversations, good questions, but I am puzzled that we're having this conversation today as the first item on the agenda.
I thought we
I thought we were already agreed in principle that we needed to have that discussion, but it was gonna be after we got through this budget cycle, because it came up in that first meeting here, right?
Yeah, and in our last meeting, I thought the idea was to start working together. I mean, Bob was there, but start working together on things. I mean, there was a loose agreement on looking at free cash, but the idea was a more regular meeting together. So I would suggest that become a more formalized thing, and different committees could submit different items for an agenda.
Whose role is it?
To start the conversation on what we're going to do with the schools.
Schools.
It's the school's role. Does the school believe that?
It's a statutory, it doesn't matter who does it.
Well, when are you going to start the conversation?
Starting the conversation is one thing. We had the conversation, it's an ongoing conversation. The decision is not a school decision, it's a town decision.
And who knows?
So the way it starts, John, I think, and sorry for interrupting, I think what you're asking is how do we initiate that conversation? We come up with this capital plan, and we say these are the needs of the school, and then we go and ask for funds. And if they, if they are major things, probably we're gonna have different conversations, but those are all part of our 5-year capital plan that we put together, and then the school committee approves it. And then it gets submitted to the capital improvement committee.
How about starting the conversation this way? We have the second half of town meeting on Monday, June 11th. What's everyone doing Thursday, June 14th?
That's it. That sounds like a great day.
Fine. And why don't we all agree that we'll have a meeting on Thursday, June 14th, here, starting at 7 p.m., and that we have a discussion about what happens in the long term.
I think that's a
Because
holiday.
John's correct. Unless we
It's
have...
Flag Day.
Flag Day?
I have no idea if that's a town holiday. I'm being
Oh,
very
June
serious.
11th
It may or may not
is a
be town
Monday.
holiday.
You meant the 15th, right?
I'm looking...
14th is a Thursday.
June 14th.
What day is this holiday?
So,
14th is a Thursday.
Thursday?
yeah, it's a Thursday. So why don't we all agree, 7 p.m., we basically be a joint meeting, select board, school committee, finance
You got it.
committee, and we have the big talk about what is gonna happen. Because John's right, we've got basically significant issues. We've got basically declining enrollment, basically 7 to 12, you're down to enrollment of about 297. In 2011, you had enrollment of 511, at least according to what you submitted to the building authority. We need to address those issues, and we need to do it not just in the segmentation of school only, but holistically for the town as a whole.
Yes.
This is a good three committee in order to do that.
Yep.
So if we start with that, and then we can return it into now to what we have to do for the budget for right now to get ready for town meeting. Does that work?
Sounds great.
Fine. Do I hear a motion that we have that meeting on June 14th? John, I'm sorry. Do I hear that?
You really speak, huh?
I'll make the motion.
Excellent. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Very good. All in favor? June
Aye.
14th.
You guys gotta vote separately.
Yeah, it's actually 3 separate meetings going on.
Yeah, for one thing,
You gotta
hang
vote
on,
as committees, you
one
can't
thing, we have an
vote as-
election coming up, we can't speak for other board members and stuff like that, so
Yeah.
I would say after the elections, we'll come together again and
No, I'm saying no. We make a definitive agreement, June 14th. We're here, 7 p.m. Even if you just show up, okay, I'm here basically in my capacity as a citizen of the town, who also happens to be the chair of the select board, that's fine. But you gotta make a definitive commitment because we keep kicking the can down the road. Time to stop kicking the can down the road.
Yes.
All right, 7 p.m., June 14th here.
All right.
Okay.
I wasn't kicking the can down the road.
All right, let's move on then to discussions about this school budget. Is there a proposed school budget? Has one been finalized?
There is a school budget that is proposed, but not voted to approve because, yeah. I think we sent it to you
Sorry.
earlier, right?
We got 25 pages of, it was not a spreadsheet, it was a PDF document this afternoon.
There's a summary page, I'm gonna basically read from the summary, but I'm gonna let our business manager do the reading for you. If he doesn't have it, I will keep it right here. You have it, right? All right. So you want the budget amount, or? I think you have a few questions here. What's the final proposed budget? What is the final request for town's contribution?
Right.
And what is the shortfall against net school spending plus 305?
Right.
final proposed budget, LEA budget, is $8,839,684. That includes transportation.
I'm sorry, is how much?
$8,839,684.
Okay.
And that is including transportation, so the net school budget, because it's broken out separately, would be $8,026,142 without the transportation.
What, 142?
Correct.
Okay, okay, thanks.
Final request for the town's contribution, I guess it depends on how you want to approach that, because we have the chapter 70, we have required local contribution, we have the 305, we have the 200 that was talked about in the last Selectboard meeting. Yeah. No, you've got this. Chapter 70 money. And the rest of it has to get voted by the town. Okay, so the net amount for that would be, from the original $8,839,000, would be $4,203,514.
And that includes, what, 813,000 something for transportation?
Correct.
How much is that?
$813,542.
Okay, the 4,203,514, what is the shortfall against net school spending plus 305,797?
That would be, at this point, $497,439.
497,439. Okay.
So if I remember, that's $200,000 less than we were hearing a month ago, right? So that $200,000 in reduced spending, or was there extra revenue to make it that $200,000? I mean, how, in other words, did that shrink by 200? I mean, that's fantastic that it did, but
Yeah.
how did it shrink to $200,000?
So it's a combination of,
Right.
some positions being deferred,
Right.
and also some cost avoidance. So for instance, an example is this social emotional learning program that we've been investing in. So one advantage of that is that people who see that whatever they need in the district is here, they come back. So after that meeting, one of the students decided to return, so that was $50,000+. That is cost avoidance that was brought back.
Right.
So it's a combination of some deferment of proposed expenses and then cost avoidance.
I have a question, Mark. What was the figure you gave for transportation?
Transportation, $813,542.
On the documents you gave us earlier today. Oh, all right. 766 is 147 and is in the athletic. What's
Yes.
the comp? Okay.
Yep.
147,
Is athletic transportation.
okay, is that
There's
normal?
transportation on the first page of
Yeah.
766.
66,542.
And then there's 47 in athletics.
Hasn't that part or all of athletic transportation normally been included in the regular budget as opposed to the transportation line?
It is in the budget. Is that what you're asking?
Is it in the budget or is it in transportation line?
It's in transportation.
It's in transportation. It's always been in transportation line?
It's always been in transportation.
They're in separate locations, but the sum is at 813.
Okay. Anybody got any other questions? All right. There was $77,766.
Should I go back to this?
Yeah, sure.
Last time when we got together, there was a $200,000 that would be added to the school budget. So we gave you against that net school spending plus $305,000.
Right.
but there was a conversation, and I believe an agreement that there was going to be $200,000 added to the school budget.
I know what you're talking about, but let me give you another perspective on this. No matter what any of us say, it's the town that decides how much the school budget is going to be.
Right.
So there's no possibility of an agreement on the budget until the town people vote. The second thing is that, from what I understand, what you're talking about took place at a meeting that was held on the one day the Finance Committee said they couldn't make it. And so this came up at a meeting that we had one member there, but just like your group, the Finance Committee cannot be represented by one member, and one member can't speak for the Finance Committee on an issue which the Finance Committee had never been involved in a conversation with. So that we understand that there is an agreement between the school committee and the select board that they will advocate for $200,000 extra, but the Finance Committee is not part of that. The Finance Committee is now here to help in its deliberations as to what we're going to recommend to the town be the budget for the school for the year.
So we're gonna return to this, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was once again, an amount of money that was a negative against free cash certification this year. $77,666.
Yeah, what is that?
Let's see. In the free cash certification, there was a deficit of over $35,000 in the school choice account, a small amount in the race to the top, $6,000 in SPED, early intervention, $36,000 in Title I, small amounts in academic support and full-day kindergarten. But it added up to the figure that we have there on the sheet. And these basically are monies that, according to the accounting that the state had, were overspent or underfunded in the school budget from 2017 budget. And that's when free cash was certified, it was based upon the balances on June 30th or July 1st of 2017 for the year. And so in past years, there had been, the school lunch had been part of those programs. So were you not aware of the amounts, of these amounts? Okay. We'll have them sent to you.
Yes, how do we find out about these things earlier as opposed to at this stage? Where do you get that information that we don't get, even though it's related to the school budget?
We get it because during the budget season, which for us started February or so, end of February, we need to know what free cash becomes part of what are the figures that go into the budget as we look at both the budget for our fiscal year 19 as well as for the special town meetings that are held in the springtime to determine spending for this year. So we have to know that so we can make recommendations as to what we think should be done.
That's great. What I'm trying to understand is, so this is information that's been available since February? Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. So how do we, as the committee that is responsible of this budget, how do we hear about that earlier so we can have our own conversation earlier as we're discussing current year budget as opposed to finding out in May?
See, it would seem to me that if you have somebody keeping your books for you and you've got an account overdrawn, that would be the most logical place for the information to come from.
So would Would that have been, I don't even know if the audit was for FY17, would that have been part of FY17 audit, or did we not do that yet? Is it going
Yeah,
to be?
audits are actually like extra year behind,
Okay,
the way
so
I think of it.
that's-
So by the time you get an audit, it's like, seems like it's 2 years old.
Okay.
I don't know the timing on all of those things. Other than June 30th or
Yeah,
July
there's-
15th.
Your internal mechanism should be whoever's looking at your books inside. The external mechanism would be, I think you would ask probably a town administrator,
Town accountant.
or the town accountant, ask the town accountant for what information they have about the free cash. Because the point, of course, is that the state thinks this money was either overdrawn or underfunded, so it's going to have to get paid.
Okay, so I guess the answer is this is the first time we're hearing about
Okay.
this. So
Okay.
there is really nothing to counter it at this point in time.
Okay. The transportation now, we may have had, yes.
Is this something that was known back in February, March? This amount that they were overdrawn to the finance committee?
The finance committee got it in March. We got it in March.
So
March 8th.
my question would be, why wouldn't someone contact the school committee and just ask, or the town working together, let them know that, do you know you're overspent by $77,000?
Well,
And I'm not playing.
yeah, no,
I'm
no,
asking a
I know,
question, that's all I'm
I
doing.
mean, that's why we're asking the question
Yeah.
too, because it's not the role of the finance committee to do that. It's probably the role of either the administration or the select board to do that, to get the, or the town accountant, role of town accountant.
It still may not be, warranted for you to do something of that nature, but I would certainly like to have a heads up if something's out of whack, $77,000. I mean, just to say, out of courtesy, because we're supposed to be working together. And I'm not, as I'm saying, that's how I feel. I mean, I'm not trying to.
We get in enough trouble when we say good things.
That's not, I gotta say, that's not the finance committee's purview.
It isn't, I realize that.
I'm not trying to correct you, Steve. It's just, for everybody, it's, I mean, we get accounts payable and receivable, and, town accountant, which maintains the general ledger, which is what's gonna go into,
No one's saying it's their responsibility.
No,
I'm just talking about if you're trying to put the things together in a town where, hey, let you know, do you realize this? Just as, I think as Steve said, like a heads up or something like that. But, and again, it's not saying anything
I'm as
against anybody.
surprised as you are.
Yeah, no, I just,
Yeah, I guess I mean, it never would have occurred to me that
you all
doesn't
didn't
know
know.
this information, right? I mean, it
Right, you
never
don't-
would have
right.
dawned on me,
It
so.
doesn't, it wouldn't
yeah.
occur to me either that we wouldn't have this information.
Right, so wherever we're getting, I mean, we're
I'm
getting it.
I'm embarrassed
Yes.
that we don't have this information.
It seems a little weird. That-
Okay. Bob, yeah, the transportation, maybe we can, no, but the question is, transportation budget is 10% more,
quite a bit.
estimated to be 10% more, budgeted for 10% more than the current appropriation. That seems like a lot.
It was budget based on what our contract is for FY19 and a 10% increase for sped. Because sped's kind of a big unknown when it comes to transportation because it's based on each individual student and whatever transportation they require. And what generally happens with anything in the sped department year over year, tuitions or services tend to go up around that amount. So rather than leaving the amount uncovered, we budget for 10% because that's usually how it seems to shake out once all the bills have come in.
So it's an estimated number of 10%. It is not
The regular
the transportation for the kids that, or for the tuitions that you're already putting out.
No, the regular transportation number is the number because it's in the contract. The sped is an estimate because it is an amalgamation of all the sped transportation that ends up needing to be provided in that fiscal year.
But you know what the number of students are.
right now.
Right now, yeah.
And
But
the
we
the
just-
changes through the year
Right.
too. Like, we could get a new student in September, and October suddenly that child maybe isn't doing well on the school bus, and then the IEP changes and it requires a van. So we have no,
Is this any different than a contingency?
we don't have any of those.
Maybe, no,
What are those?
but by any other name before.
It's an estimate,
Yeah.
given our past history, and again, we have students who now are required to be educated if they're on a long-term suspension. It's known in the law as 37H and a half, and we have to provide transportation and their education if they are suspended long-term, i.e. expelled. So we have to bear the burden of that cost. So it's an estimate that we may in fact have a long-term suspension that we have to transport a student to an out-of-district
So there's a
placement.
specific case there that you think?
We have one this year,
Right,
yes,
that's
and so
driving
we
the
have
case.
some history that may in fact occur.
When we're having discussions about the new school, we were hoping that there would be some transportation savings. Are those liable to happen or not?
Well, we're still transporting the same number of students. The only change is that they're going to be picked up and dropped off at the same location, and this year we had split that, so we're not anticipating any savings in transporting students.
One additional thing is that regular transportation is on a 3-year contract. So next time we have contract negotiations, it may be part of the conversation. But right now, it doesn't really allow us to make any changes to accommodate for it if there isn't. Remember, this whole thing is based on the number of runs. And number of runs did not change for us. We reduced the number of runs a couple of times in the past, you guys would remember. There is really nothing that tells us that the number of runs can be reduced. If we get to that point, and because of the single location, if there is a way to accommodate all these students with fewer runs, next time contract is negotiated, that's going to be part of the conversation.
When's the contract up? When's the next time negotiated?
This year?
No, actually, I think we've been a couple of years, let me call up the contract. But the other thing to keep in mind, I mean, we've been tracking transportation expenses and sped. We were running about $10,000 ahead of schedule, and mind you, this is a separate warrant article. So if we don't spend the money, it's not school funds, it's town funds. But we were tracking about $10,000, but the other thing that we have in the back of our minds is that when we went out and did the budget and had it voted and approved, the transportation contract got rebid because there was a defect in the contract because one of the participants dropped it off at the wrong location and they didn't arrive at the same time. When they got rebid, the contract actually ended up being $7,400 higher than what our for the regular transportation was. So we knew, and we discussed it at the time it happened, going forward, that we needed to have some savings on the sped side, so the sped contract should come in total in budget. So even with the extra that we have, and this is how tight that we run it, when we looked at this a month ago and said, we think we may come in 10,000 under the sped transportation, we got to make up 7,300 on the regular transportation side. So we're running it just about even for the budget.
Good. Well, I think with the new school, wasn't the thought that there were going to be fewer buses that were needed? Because not just that you had the same number of students, but all of a sudden, the buses are going to one location. What was there was some conversation that we had an estimate that we were on savings in transportation.
Well, we just went to using the same run for East Meadow.
They already did that.
Yeah, West Street, so I think whatever you're saying, we've already combined it once, right?
They drop off at different places, now they'll be dropping off at the same place.
Okay.
We used to have 8 runs, I don't know when that was, we reduced to 7 runs, I think. And so, some of those things, and those are good points, and I'm sure they're popping up, but even in terms of, say, the principal, we already went down to 1 principal before those schools came together, so the same principal was going back and forth between 2 buildings, and this is going to be relief for him, actually, that he can't remain on the same one.
Okay. Any other questions on transportation? Questions on transportation? Okay. There's a warrant article for 2 students to attend Smith Oak. Why is this a separate article rather than part of the school budget?
Sorry.
Why is this a separate article rather than part of the school budget?
Vocational tuition, vocational education is the responsibility of the town. And in Granby, it has been voted as a separate warrant.
Does Smith Voc get the Chapter 70 money for these students?
Smith Folk, do they get?
It's the same,
They would get Chapter 70. So here's, I think this is where the confusion is happening. This is vocational school. We are not a vocational school. The law that oversees the placement of vocational school students is Chapter 74, which says if there are students who would like to go and pursue a vocational education, they have to be accommodated, including their transportation. So one advantage that we have in Granby is that we created this regional district, Pathfinder, and they've been able to accommodate most of the needs from Granby students, vocational needs. So we have 24 or so students currently enrolled at Pathfinder. The student that came last year, which was part of the unanticipated expense request from the special town meeting, we do not offer that program. Are we allowed to tell the program what it is?
yes.
That doesn't
All right.
make it.
So that's a criminal justice program that we don't have, and this is actually a practical criminal justice program that we could not even find anywhere else. Just that's why the student picked that. Here's the thing: if that program had existed at Pathfinder, let's just assume that Pathfinder charges our students a little over $16,000 per student for tuition right now. That's the current rate. The amount that we are paying for that student, let's start with that one student, is a little over $17,000 because we don't have a mutual agreement with Smith Voc and it had to be accommodated. So wherever we send the students, the difference, Pathfinder versus Smith Voc, the difference in terms of tuition would have been about $1,000 or so. The additional financial payment is coming from the transportation side, which we have to provide as well. And that is about $19,000 or so per year. The second student that applied to go to Smith Voc, again, it's the same thing, it's vocational, we're not vocational. Chapter 74 dictates that they go to a school where they can pursue that vocational education. After that came about, Cheryl reached out to Pathfinder because our conversation was, well, this is something that potentially could exist. We don't see it on their roster right now, but potentially could exist at Pathfinder. Sure enough, they are working on creating a program for that particular vocation. And if they do by the beginning of next school year, then we will be able to tell the student the program exists in Pathfinder, that's our regional school district, and we will send you there. Part of the transportation expense and everything that belongs to Pathfinder. If that doesn't happen, we are really hopeful that it will happen. But if that doesn't happen, additional transportation costs for that additional student will not be a huge amount. It adds, I don't know, $5 to $10, I don't know what it is, I'm just making up, per day. These are all per diem transportation costs. So compared to the first one, the second student's transportation costs would be much lower to begin with, but we are still hopeful that by the beginning of the school year, Pathfinder will have instituted a program that can accommodate that student.
Yeah, I think we were getting at asking something a little different. We belong to the Pathfinder regional.
We're part of the district.
We're part of the district. And so that Chapter 70 money that would have been given to Granby for the students to go to Pathfinder are not given to Granby. They're sent directly to Pathfinder. We don't, years ago, they used to kind of funnel through the books, I think, but that no longer happens. They get the money.
So it's not school choice.
They get the money somewhere.
It's not like school choice.
School choice, the state pays the money directly to the school district.
Yes, but if there are students going outside the district, we still keep part of that, and then we send part of the state aid to that receiving district.
So, and Pathfinder has a program it sounds like, or not an educational program, but has a system that sounds like Smith Voc does, is that if you don't belong to the district, they have a way for a student to pay tuition to go to the schools. And as part of their budget process, they always take a look at the number of tuition students that they have coming into Pathfinder. We did not think that Pathfinder got any of the Chapter 70 money for the students who come in as tuition-paying students. And so, but again, we don't know for certain what all the ins and outs of these things are, but the suspicion is that the Chapter 70 money still comes to Granby. In which case, this ought to be treated as a Granby student.
Are they counted as enrollment, the kids that go to, I don't think so, right?
I don't have access, but I will tell you, and I may be off on this one, based on my research and my understanding. First of all, Pathfinder is a regional school district. So they do benefit from certain things that we do benefit from as well. My understanding is that Chapter 70 is one of those, but we can look into it. I just don't have access to the data right now.
Yeah, we know that there are a lot of different state laws that apply to the different, there's the school choice, there's a vocational program, there's the charter schools, and that kind of stuff.
Do you need internet access? You can.
No, I might have the regional schools here too.
Any other questions on that? Any other questions on it? In the original budget for this year, per the presentation previous year, you had planned on 2 first-grade classes totaling 48 students. And now as they're moving on to the second grade, there seems to be 2 fewer students, and yet you're calling for an additional class. Is that correct?
So I'm actually not following this question.
Last,
Do you mean second grade? Second grade's where they added the teacher.
Right.
right.
That one's from 2 to
The
3.
kids in second grade are kids that are in first grade now.
No,
Kids-
they're going into
that-
third grade next year.
No, the kids that are going to be.
I phrased it all right. The presentation was a presentation made a year ago.
Okay.
When you listed the number of kids in the, going into, anticipated for second grade a year ago, the number was 48. The number anticipated for this coming fall was
Right.
46. But you've got 3 teachers
Right.
this year, right? And last year you were. along
So
with
second
2.
grade was where we had the issue this year, where
Because
we
more
had,
came- more
all of
came
a
in,
sudden, we
yes.
had enrollment, so we certainly don't want to be in that position this year, which is why we opted to have the additional teacher.
But you won't be in the situation unless 7 more kids come in.
No, actually, right at, 23 is right at the number, it's actually too large to start. So I would argue that class size at grade 1 really should be at 20. So it's a wait and see, 1 or 2 more students move in, and we need that third teacher.
I'm just trying to line up the numbers here, right? So we hired the extra second grade teacher. So we were 2 teachers in first, 2 in second, 2 in third originally, right? And then we hired 1 more in second grade.
No, there were 3 in first.
There were 3 in first, 2 in second, 2 in third.
Correct,
And next year there will be 3, 3, and 3
correct.
is the plan then. So this then, I mean, this is another part of the disconnect then. I hear what you're saying, I hear you wanted the 3 per grade, but when the argument was made at the town meeting about hiring this second grade teacher, it was billed as, it's just 1 year, that teacher will then move up to third grade the following year, which then would be the extra third grade class, but now this budget has another teacher added on top of that one moving up. In other words, you added 1 last year and now there's being added. And this is just making it all clear, right? We're going from 7 teachers to 9 teachers.
Actually,
We
we're
added 1 more.
We're reducing grade 6.
I'm just saying, in that first 3 grades, there used to be 7 teachers. There was 1 added last year to get to 8. Part of the argument of 8 was, well, we're gonna need the 8, but then there'll be 8 the following year, and now we're at 9. I think that's accurate. That's all I'm trying to just make sure that we're all on the same page about
So
what the budget has.
This year,
Right.
we have 2 kindergarten, 3 first, 3 second,
And 2 third.
2 third.
Right.
Correct.
And next year, you're thinking 3 first, 3 second, 3 third.
Correct.
Right.
3 kindergarten.
And 3 kindergarten.
And 3 kindergarten. So this is a net add of another teacher. And so there was an add of a teacher during this current school year. and then we're keeping that teacher and then adding another teacher the following year.
Those are two.
The one we have now staying, and then I don't
No,
know.
they're gonna be 3 kindergarten.
Oh, they're adding another kindergartner teacher too.
Well, there are 3 sixth grades currently.
I'm just,
Hold on.
yeah.
One of those, we're gonna go down to 2 classes for a 6th grade.
Right.
So the teacher that will be freed up will come down to.
I hear you, right? I'm just trying to make sure we're getting the grades all right here, that this is an increase in the K through 3 teacher.
But we don't look at it as K through 3, we look at it as K through 6. So how can we most flexibly use the staff that we have? And because we have a reduction in the number of 5th graders going to 6th grade, we don't need that 3rd grade teacher, so that teacher can be used to support the request for the additional classroom at the primary.
Well, there was a reason that we would have done K through 3 originally, because used to be a separate school, right? And so it's not unusual to think K through 3 and 4 through 6 is.
But we don't have to think like that
Right.
anymore, is what I guess.
So that's fine, so.
But it would have happened anyway, that teacher, whether their home
Right.
was East Meadow or West Street, if the class size didn't designate that there was a need for the 3rd classroom, the teacher would have been moved.
Right.
Or the position, I should say, the position would have been moved.
Teacher may have not.
Right, exactly.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So wait a minute, I'm confused about this conversation. What is your concern that there's an increase of 2 teachers?
No, my concern was that the rhetoric of adding the teacher and the teacher moving up made it sound like there would go back to 2 2nd grade teachers for the following year, and there'd be an extra 3rd grade teacher. That was what I heard at town meeting, was this position for 2nd grade would then move up to 3rd grade, which left the implication that we'd still only have 2 teachers in 2nd grade. Then I hear there's been a second change, which I'm fine with, of moving a teacher equivalent from 6th grade to 2nd grade. I just want to make sure it's all clear, right? I mean, part of the problem we have is you hear the things and then the stories change because you all are so mired in the details, you see it all, and then I'm sitting there and then I just hear, why is there in other words, we see the thing about requesting the teacher, we see the teacher moving from 2nd to 3rd, which I expected, but yet there's not a drop in the 2nd grade. That just looks weird, right? I mean, that just looks weird, and I'm glad to hear it's not weird, right?
So I just want to make sure
yeah.
that we're speaking to that concern, because I know as you're taking this information in, this is what's going to be guiding your decision on whether or not you support funds out of stabilization come the town meeting. So I want to make sure that we speak.
No, I've heard exactly. I mean, I think I've heard exactly what.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah, no.
that we speak to the
I think that's
concern.
exactly. I mean, in other words, so
Let me ask it again.
Yeah.
A year ago, you made a decision with 48 children in the 2nd grade to have 2 teachers. This year, you made a conscious decision with 46 to have 3. What's the difference in the thought process from a year ago to now? Because the fact that there's a freed up 6th grade teacher really has no bearing on the issue of how many teachers there are in the 2nd grade.
Well, I beg to differ. And I'd say I look at, just hear what the school committee talked about as far as, teaching a younger student in 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade versus someone in 6th grade, as far as the classroom size.
I'm not dealing with 6th grade. It was sort of, the implication was that it was they had a teacher that they needed something to do with. And they didn't really have to hire anyone. No, they didn't, but they had to reassign them.
Well, I don't know that. That's their call. I don't know that. I can't speak to that. That's something they decided on. Whatever their feelings were at the time, they thought they had to.
Depending on the teacher, the certifications that that teacher has. You just can't relocate a teacher without not necessarily having the proper, qualifications.
I understand the question. I think it was a different budget cycle last year. The deficit was huge. We were faced with some very difficult decisions, and that was a very difficult decision that we had to make. I think it was the wrong decision. Educationally, it was the wrong decision. So this year, we're not making the wrong decision. It's a different
But the
budget.
budget isn't much better this year than it was a
Well, it
year ago.
is. I mean, it is, actually. So, we're very pleased with enrollment at the primary levels. We are ecstatic that we're seeing increased resident enrollment in Granby, particularly at the primary levels, and it is what parents see as Granby. A strength of Granby is that their children will develop very strong relationships with their teachers in those primary grades.
It'll be a good conversation when we meet June 14th. Because we are, for instance, this year was the first year that I remember. We will end the year with more students in our district than we started with. And it's about 10, 11 students, not only on elementary. And we are hopeful that elementary will see many more students. We're already getting all those applications and stuff, and that's expected. But we're also seeing students coming to high school level as well. That's why, these numbers we're hoping, are likely to change even before the school year begins, upward. John?
Yep.
For Chapter 78, Pathfinder, they are receiving Chapter 78. For instance, FY 18, they're estimated, this is something that was on my computer, it was $5.4 million, Chapter 78 to them.
Right, yeah, they get chapter, and I think, what figure was it, 390,000, something, it was some large number for the number of students that go
Our
there from.
contribution ranges anywhere from like 200,000 to above 300,000. We get charged based on the proportion of students from Granby in the whole student body.
But in addition to that, there's Chapter 70 money because of Granby students that go there. And they give us that figure. That figure, I think, was handed out this year for the first time in quite a while. Yeah, so, but that's just for, I thought that was just for the students who are part of the district. And that when they charge tuition for students coming out of the district, part of it is because they don't get Chapter 70 money for those students.
No, they are getting it.
For students from out of the district?
Well, Chapter 78 is not based on students moving around. It's just like us. The previous year's numbers, based on that, Chapter 70 calculation says this is the state aid you will get. And it's a combination of all those towns that constitute the Pathfinder Regional Vocational School District. I don't know what portion of this may or may not be what could have been Granby's share, but what I know is that when the calculation is made for Chapter 70, the school choice is not included. And therefore, any movement that may be happening afterwards is not included in Chapter 78. Chapter 78 is strictly based on the number of students you happen to have in your town at a certain point in time, which is typically October 1st of the previous year.
Actually be in your district, because Pathfinder is a public school district.
It is.
No different than any other public school district, so they're not getting our Chapter 70 fund, they're getting their own, because we're part of that district, and they will get their money based on enrollment.
Which means there's a small portion of it, or 20 odd, or whatever it is, based upon the Granby kids going there.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think, again, just I may be misunderstanding it, but the confusion may be because any district receives some Chapter 78, right? If we do send some students, if some Granby students want to go elsewhere, that's to a public school, that's school choice, then yes, part of the tuition that we could otherwise receive is going to that district. In this case, Pathfinder is its own district, it gets the money, and we don't really have school choice to Pathfinder. You go there, you become a student there, you become part of that district.
We don't.
No, we don't. We have 24
We don't have
students
school
who are
choice,
enrolled there
But
full-time.
somebody from South Hadley could go there and conceivably under school choice.
I don't know. I don't have the answer.
Probably, it's a
I
public
think
school.
well, I think they take,
I think something from South Hadley would be much like the Smith Oak student
Yeah.
here,
Okay.
is that you're going in as a tuition because you're not part of that district's consortium.
well, Smith Folk won't take school choice.
No problem.
So
it's a
consequently,
tuition.
the only way you can get
It's a
there is
tuition.
Pay the
either
tuition.
be in the
Yes.
district or pay
Yes.
the,
Yep.
pull the tuition.
Yeah.
So, but you're saying that when a student from Granby goes to a different school district, they go to South Hadley or Ludlow or someplace, that school district gets the bulk of the Chapter 70 money, but Granby actually gets some Chapter 70 money for that student? Is that what you just said?
Yes, we keep some of the money here because there are students, and then there's a formula that says up to so much, capped at 5,000 or whatever that number is, has to be sent to the other district. So when you receive, for instance, when we receive school choice students, we don't just get the entire amount that the state gave to that district for that student. We get part of that. It's the same thing when our students go elsewhere. So we don't get when students come in, I don't know if that was the impression, but we don't get the full state aid that is given for that child. We get part of it. Yeah.
You know how much?
I think it's capped at $5,000.
About 5,000 unless there's a special education
Yeah,
increment.
that's different.
How much do we keep for our students going elsewhere? All but 5,000.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Well answered.
That would be, I believe that's either around 5,000 or slightly less than, I'm not sure what our per pupil state aid is.
About 10,000.
Is it 10,000 or so per student?
It was like 10,137. But I
So we're
believe
keeping
for
about
school choice
$5,000.
students, The town where the student lives, that's where the Chapter 70 funds go. And then the outgoing payment gets made when they choice out somewhere else. So if we have a student who lives in Granby, but school choices to another town, Granby gets the credit for them being a resident, and that's part of the Chapter 70 calculation. But then we also have to pay out $5,000 because they're attending school, choice at school, not in their own district.
So that's on the school choice operation. It sounds to me that it's not really known what happens on the Smith folk.
Well, that's because this is a
Situation.
really weird situation.
Right.
Usually you
Yeah.
have kids who attend the member school.
Right.
And so I was just saying to Charlotte, we'll have to research it a little bit because I don't know who gets the Chapter 70 money when you're going to a school that's not your regional school and you have to tuition it in.
Do you know how it works with charter schools?
Not off the top of my head, no.
That's a different formula.
It's a different formula.
Is it the same thing? Is state money?
No, it's, if I remember correctly, like, they take X amount the first year the kid goes to charter school, X amount and then it like basically kind of like, until it's like all the money.
I think it's like a 3-year process where they
Yeah.
they wean you off of
It
it.
phases in.
And then they become their student.
Yeah.
Yeah, the first year, it's 100% of the tuition is reimbursed, and then it goes down 75, 50, 25, and then it's assumed after that the district is absorbing the cost of the tuition for the student in the charter school.
And it's routinely underfunded by the state. That's
Right,
one-
yeah, we know that. We've been hearing about that for, it's been a problem.
So that does the Chapter 70 money stop being split with the charter schools eventually? Or is it's still always split between? That's one of the things you don't know yet. We got to find out. Okay. Okay.
So,
Chapter 70 that we get from the state is about 6,000 plus. So the state gives us $6,230 as of FY18. And we have to send about $5,000, if that's what you're asking, about $5,000 of it to the other district.
So keep about $1,200?
Of the state portion of the aid, yes, we keep $1,200. And honestly, that's why these conversations are always important, because we are a net receiving school. We've been, and any message that may give the impression to anybody that, hey, these things are not really working out in Granby, or we're shutting down a school, or we're reducing programs, services, teachers, that always, you can see it. The impact is almost immediate. You just see that, the numbers go down. And that is the challenge with school choice. School choice is a reality that we're living with. It's not the ideal situation. But, our students go elsewhere. Some students come here, but we've been in net positive, and we want to make sure that we keep it that way, because there are a lot of students who see a lot of promise in Granby Public Schools, and they would like to come here. And we want to make sure that if they choose to do so, they have a place to come.
Okay. Any other questions? we looked at the Granby's per pupil cost. And we started with the figures that Cheryl, you had. And there was some money missing from the Granby piece. So later on in the handouts there's a page that looks like this is per pupil expenditures. And this corrects the Granby figures. And on these figures, as you can see, Granby, among the 6 towns that were chosen for the presentation, Granby is actually the second highest in per pupil expenditures. Way out in front is Ludlow. You take a look at what they're spending per pupil compared to other towns. It's just astonishing, and it shows up a little bit elsewhere in some other figures. But
they have a serious amount of poverty, a lot of rent. We tend to have rentals, we tend to have poverty, and where you have poverty, you tend to have a lot.
Yes.
It drives up cost of services.
Yeah, it's got to be really tough for them. But Granby is right up there. We're spending a lot of money, and there are other ways to take a look at that. And we are in fact very concerned about the property taxes in Granby. And we know that your job, part of the school committee, is to take a look at things from an education point of view. We understand that. What we have to do is balance that with what the effect on the taxpayers is going to be. And we do have a problem in Granby, and because if you see down there in the second box, over 91.5% of our revenue, our tax levy, comes from individual homeowners. The town that is the best deal here is Hadley, because they have such a big base of businesses. They pull in an awful lot of money someplace else, but really, it's got to be the Granby taxpayers that fund the stuff. So we keep that in mind, and we have to consider that. And I'm sure, as you know, when it goes to the taxpayers, they consider it too. So, but at any rate, this is.
Yeah, we also know that, John, that's from pure financial perspective, that's fine. But we also know that residents of Granby care about their schools, and they would like to see how we can improve this. I'm trying to get to the total numbers spent based on this per pupil expense and see whether or not it really adds up to the amount that we're spending, but I didn't get there. But what is really important for us then? Per pupil expenditure, which is something that we've been bringing up in the past. I'm glad that it's not popping up, because the numbers are showing what they are showing. If we have more students, per pupil expense will go down, because you have fixed costs, right, that are not changing, and if the number of students increase, then your per pupil expenditure will go down, and that's exactly what we're hoping to do as these numbers increase. Because you look at our budget year after year. The change in our budget is not really, at least what we're voting for at the town meeting, is not really dramatic changes, right? What the dramatic change we have is on the enrollment side. So the fewer students, now you have a higher per pupil expense, at least on paper.
Well, we didn't include the figures in here, but last year we thought it was pretty dramatic, because we looked at what the cost per pupil increase was, percentage compared to what the cost of inflation was. So it's just that you can always make a case that, well, we want to do this and we want to do that, and it takes this many people, but you still have to collect money from individuals, taxpayers, to do that.
Yes and no, because you're going to collect some from the state, and I think, Jim, you're the expert on this, but part of the issue is economy of scale. And if we added, say, 40 kids to Granby High School, we might not have to hire anybody. We would and that would basically mean that our costs would not really rise dramatically, and we would get money from the state. So now your per pupil costs will actually go down by just adding population. Isn't that right?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, it's more complicated because of the school thing. I mean, you do these breakouts of the fixed variable costs, but they're funny for the school, right? Because what are the fixed costs for the school? And so the story you just told, teachers are the fixed costs. But if all 40 of those kids came in 5th grade, you do have to hire new teachers. And so depending upon where the new kids come in, suddenly you may or may not have to add costs. So there's probably, you could figure out the maximum amount of kids if they came in exactly the right grades and had the right electives and so on, that you could minimize it. But then you can also tell a story where it'd be a very rapid increase in costs from it. If you got too many in a school and you burst out of your classroom space, and so you have to add classroom space. So all of these things, I mean, these are
really
tricky
hard to
conversations.
actually, you can't even think it out, because, I mean, I teach in a school, and to try to actually figure out.
No, I think you can think it out, but you have to think it out with a particular school. You don't do it in general, right? So that was my first question. We said there's fixed costs. I'll be honest, right? My first thought is, I wonder what the fixed costs are for Granby. I mean, what is the total of it? What's the percentage? And I realize you may not know the answer to that, because how do you figure out what's a fixed cost and what's not a fixed cost and all those sorts of things? So it's not obvious that as you add students, this per pupil cost goes down. But it's also not obvious that it goes up, right? It will depend on a lot of things.
I would think that it will go down, but not necessarily linearly proportionate to whatever the. So let's think of it this way. If we go back to that number that we saw earlier, slightly over $10,000 per pupil state aid. Let's say you suddenly have, what's the gap that we talked about? Slightly under $500,000, right? So you suddenly have 50 new school-age students in Granby. That basically, the state aid brings that. Does it take out some? Chances are, yes, you're going to have to add a couple of teachers and all that stuff, But the enrollment drives state aid primarily. So that is why it is the focus of our conversations at the very least.
No, and I get the enrollment drive is what you talk about. In other words, one of the reasons Granby has a hard time is it's a very small school district compared to school districts in the state. And trying to run a small school district is expensive and difficult and presents a challenge that you guys go through all the time. I mean, that makes total sense. Adding 1 or 2 students helps a little, right? Doubling the size of the school creates a whole new school, right? And then you have to figure out what that all looks like and so on. I think that's why Rob's right. Sitting down with that kind of a conversation and these are hard conversations to have, because, you want to be able to have them frankly, and I get it. You want to have them frankly, which means you want to talk about optimistic and pessimistic scenarios. You start talking about pessimistic scenarios, and if that's all people hear, then they just get pessimistic about it, rather than, we economists, we're just used to, well, you just talk about all the cost and benefits, and, but then I get it. There's also a PR angle to the discussions, but that makes the discussions harder to have, because we really want to figure out, it seems to me like, okay, let's imagine the school growth thing happens, you add 50 or 60 new students, it works. What will that look like? What are the new problems that'll arise? How are we going to accommodate them? What are you going to do? But you also, at the same time, need to also talk, well, what if that doesn't work? Where will that go? How does it happen? Things like that. And I hear what you're saying. I mean, you've been very clear about it. You don't like having the conversation of what happens if it doesn't work, because you think it increases the probability of it not working. And I hear that, right? But it's hard to answer the kind of questions Mark's talking about like what happens if you add new students, if we can't have a frank discussion of, well, if this doesn't work, where do we go? And then that leads to, I think, a lot of the lack of feeling of communication and so on, of just this.
I mean, part of the calculus of that too, when you have your per pupil expenditure, do we have a breakdown of what's the fixed cost of that versus the variable expense of that? Is there a proportionality? Or do we know that?
I know it's hard.
And I mean, that's an analysis that would be really helpful to have, because that allows you then to start doing these kind of projections.
Right. Because some part of your budget is going to go up, right? And what are the areas where you can look for ways of doing things differently, efficiencies, and this and that.
Yeah.
I mean, we are having these conversations. It's not a huge portion of our budget, obviously, but it is still something to talk about. And going back to what you said, it is true that we want to look at the future very optimistically. And in fact, that is true when I do strategic planning at work. It's true when I do strategic planning for my nonprofit and all that, right? Because that's why you do a strategy. How can I get to a better place?
However, I don't know that we are really blind to the fact that we have to see whether or not that strategy gets us where we want to be. So we do measure, and then some things will work out, some things will not work out. So we are prepared that some things will not necessarily work out the way we planned. The question then becomes, what do we do in response? Again, you're right that we tend to look at it, how do we solve that problem? As opposed to, you know what, this didn't work out, no, let's stop talking about it and let's shut the door, Kevin. So.
Let me explain the genesis of the figures. These are the school districts that in the original presentation all contributed substantially more net school spending above the requirement.
Yeah.
So what I did was I wanted to see, that could be reasons. So I put these numbers together to see whether the town really supports the schools equal to the other communities.
Yeah.
And even though it isn't called net school spending or so much above net school spending, it would appear that we hold our own.
So, because you have numbers, and I will not, push back on numbers that you're sharing, here's what I would suggest. We have to look at it has to be time series from my perspective. I mean, when we first started talking about per pupil expense and how we were lagging behind, it wasn't just a convenient year. I'm not saying that this is. But because we're looking at something like 2017 when the numbers are at, almost historic low and all that stuff, before we started seeing this increase, yes, it may be the case. Or it may not be the case, but I would like to look at it a little differently to see where it is. I don't even know what these per pupil expenses in total correspond to be able to say whether or not that really is the amount that our schools are spending.
They come from the Department of Education. I mean, it's their annual report.
Here's the honest truth. We are looking at our budget every month. At least once every month, we go through the numbers. What is spent? What's the run rate? Are we really, how are we doing against last year's run rate? Where are we spending the money? Where are we seeing the increases? We're having all those conversations with Torture Mark all the time. The one thing that we can't always see is how Desi is putting those things together. So I spend a lot of time in Desi, but I can't always go and find the things that I can find in our ledger,
It's just here because it was used in the presentation, so the figures are all your figures except for the correction for the Granby figures. And so we wouldn't change anything else except to give the true picture of Granby.
This is another part of the rhetorical problem that we run into of does this town support schools? And then we come up to the yearly budget cycle and it becomes you vote for this if you like the schools, and if you don't want to vote for it, you don't like the schools. And I guess part of the rhetoric is how you count these numbers. There's probably 80 different ways to get totals, right? There's the one that would just be this little small set of things, but then there's the other that you include in the amount spent on transportation, you include the amount we're spending on building a new building, and let's be honest, that's not a small chunk of change that the town is spending on the schools. It doesn't show up in a yearly budget, but it's spent on the schools. The new roof for the high school, not a small chunk of change. So there's all of this other spending that this town is doing on schools that dwarfs the 200,000, 400,000 difference. And this again would be my plea of, this conversation's been very good in the sense of we're just trying to sort out some questions here and things like that. This is the right tone for a conversation. We're all on the same page here at the end of the day, and we're trying to figure out the right way to get this taken care of. So we hear this town doesn't fund its schools rhetoric, and then you realize, well, if you count it differently, this town's spending more on schools, and then you count it a different way, and then we're spending less, and you're counting more. But at the end of the day, I think what you said, this town likes schools. I don't think there's any doubt about it. This town also spends a lot on schools. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Should this town spend a little bit more on next year's school budget is a different question than does the town support schools.
I hear you, but again, now we change our parameters. So it became a moving target. Now we're looking at per pupil expense, right? So if a school district has 500 students, and there are some school districts like that, right? So you may have $20,000 per student,
Right.
right? And they will not have spent, or they will have spent as much as we do. That doesn't say anything whether or not how that amount compares to the town's budget, how that compares to the tax levy. We have to look at this overall as a financial thing, just because when we start focusing on one thing to say, hey, you know, when you look at this particular year, per pupil seems to really rival everybody else around us, then of course we can find all the convenient numbers, I mean, you know, right? And have that conversation. I guess what I'm saying is that I'm not gonna say this is right or wrong. It's just how do we really look at this holistically to see our expenditure on education and schools.
Can I interject here for a minute? Select board's been here since Q5. So, that's what I'd like to say.
I commend you on your service to the town, Mark. Can we vote that we think Mark's doing a great job?
I think the good news for you is we're down to 2 questions.
Yeah, that's
Well, but let me take you through, or tell you where you can look for some other stuff that is different from saying, look at this per pupil expenditure, which we thought was important to you were in your presentation earlier. The bottom line on property taxes is that among these 6 communities, we have the highest average property taxes. We have the second highest tax rate. And there's been a misunderstanding about free cash and stabilization funds. And so there are 2 pages in here that show you, the very last page shows you the free cash that was certified as of July 1st every year, going back to 1981, and shows you what the stabilization fund balance was in every year since we started, and shows you what the landfill revenue was for the years where we had landfill revenue coming in. And you can obviously pick any small group of years that you want to and draw whatever conclusion, but we just looked at the whole batch of the years, and over the whole batch of the years, we've come to the conclusion you subtract out the landfill revenue, and this isn't adjusted for the interest that we get, which is most of it. You subtract out the landfill revenue from what the totals of free cash that have come in over the years, and we average about $300,000 a year in free cash. Now, we've had a bunch in the last few years, but overall, all these years, about $300,000 free cash. The budgeting system has also changed a little bit in that there's a conscious effort now on the part of the town administrator doing the initial budget and the finance committee agreeing with this as a principle for running state, is that the town doesn't actually budget all of its money in the June meeting. For years and years and years, the town budget has operated as the basic budget plan in June, and then a series of special town meetings later in the year, usually in the springtime. And one reason is that you find out sometime in February or so what the free cash is for the year, so you can get a much better picture of how much you have to spend. And that's when all of the time comes for a lot of expenditures for heavy equipment, for the buildings that we've done, for some operations. But overall, it's a better way, we think, to do the budget for the town, because you know there's other things that are kind of, for the rest of the town, the expenses aren't as easily seen as they are for the schools. For the schools, it seems to be an easier job to say that you run the schools, you're going to have these education, most all your costs are people costs. So you're going to run your education system based upon the people, and then you got other stuff to add there, and things could break. On the town, it doesn't seem to be that simple, because we've got a lot of these equipment costs which have been planned out for. Last one planned was a 15-year time frame for replacing the rolling equipment, and there's a lot of records on this sort of stuff. So it's not an accident that there is more free cash coming in than there used to, because the town has been under budgeting for. I mean, you could assume you're going to have so much free cash coming in and just budget it all away in June. It doesn't do that.
So the town is planning for some contingency for unexpected expenses?
Well, if you take a look at what's in the stabilization fund, and for example, in stabilization fund, because we were looking at some other figures, there are a couple dates that are marked here, but if you look back in 2010, we had $3.8 million in the stabilization fund. In March this year, there was $3.4 million in the stabilization fund, so about in the same range, except that we have borrowed things in the past that at the time, although a town meeting cannot in any way compel a town meeting in the future to spend any money, the idea is that it sets out what the principle is for paying back loans, for example. So we have forward commitments. Commitments is very loosely used there. It's not a real commitment. Money has to come from someplace, but it doesn't have to come from stabilization funds. They would say that we're going to have $3.1 million effective balance as of March 22nd. There's not a lot of cash. There just is not a lot of cash. The town has not spent the time to come up with a formal financial plan. But from what we can tell from looking at a lot of other towns that have done that, this is about in the right ballpark. And if you remember years ago, the school committee used to have between a $500,000 and $800,000 basically stabilization fund. About that much money or more was coming in from school choice every year. And the school committee always held that much in reserve so that when unexpected expenses came up later in the year, they would spend money out of that school fund that they kept. That changed all of a sudden when that was run down to zero and then was not attempted to be built back up. In the past, they could always build it back up to the $500,000 range. But it changed with the budgeting one year when all the money was spent and no effort was made to replace the money so that all the $500,000 that continued to come in was just spent.
That was
That's not correct.
That was 3 superintendents ago, we had a big chunk. This is like prior to Isabellini. There was a lot, what John's saying is basically correct. We had a lot of money coming in, anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million in school choice. And when that last superintendent left, she wanted to leave it a balanced budget and no cuts. So what she did was, she spent all of the money and drained that fund. That was also the time when we went to Chartwell's and TMS.
Yeah. So the point is that that analogy applied to the town would work exactly the same way. If we keep running the stabilization fund money down and it runs out, and it'll take a while, but it'll happen, what is the town going to do? Same thing that the schools are doing, looking for ways to get more money from wherever you can. And it's not a good system for running a town.
Yeah, well, I think that's a conversation for a June 14th meeting.
Sure it is, yes.
Yes. John, can we jump ahead to the retired employees insurance question? Just curious about that.
Any questions on this? The figures are there for you to take a look at. So.
Well, here's the thing. I don't want to get into, and especially since Mark told us that he's been here for so many hours, I don't want to get into the details of this.
4 hours and 5 minutes.
4 hours and 5 minutes. But Bob mentioned the need for a plan a couple of meetings ago, and I think we all agree. Whether or not other towns have, similar things or not, we should have our own plan, and it should reflect what we need. There are some towns that do not keep this much in their stabilization. They spend their free cash for different purposes, right? It may be right, may be wrong. I'm not just saying that. But that's a good conversation to have. For instance, if you look at 2017, you may have something more than that. Just say it's about $4 million, right? What is our budget? Our budget is about $21 million, maybe a little more than that. So about, what is this? 20% of our budget roughly is in stabilization? It's the equivalent of 20% of our budget?
No.
$4 million compared to $20 million?
Oh, we're talking about 4 million? I just did 3 point.
Well, 3 point.
Let's just 15% of our budget. I'm just gonna bring it down. So are those the right percentages to have? That's the conversation that I think would benefit all of us to get into.
We have exactly the same question.
Good.
Exactly the same question.
The other thing is about free cash, right? We are having both sides of that conversation. In free cash, it's good to have free cash. But, the state doesn't require free cash, recommends free cash for a good reason. but there are also percentages that are, good for this, good for that, and you put it aside for different purposes. Here's the other side of it. You give us the fact that our tax rate is on the higher side. We spent, I would say we spent our money well. We spent it on all these investments, public safety complex, even though we paid cash for it. Public safety complex is there, the library is there, we have a brand new school out there, right? So now, we are saying our taxes are high. And then on the other side, we're saying we have all this free cash. Let's just assume, doesn't mean that it's best practice. We had spent part of that free cash to give some relief to the taxpayer. I'm just, you take a little part of that money and you say we're gonna lower your tax rate. Would that allow us then go in front of them and say, hey, you know what? Your tax rate is not really one of the highest anymore in the state, and have that conversation? Again, not based on judgment, but we're trying to have both sides of the narrative. We have so much extra in free cash, which is mostly already taxed revenue for the town, right? There are some other sources for it, but most of it is tax revenue. And then we tell the town residents, we are taxed to the max, and then there is no room for you to really even consider anything. The start of the conversation was taxpayers cannot pay more for new structure, taxpayers cannot pay more for, to support the school budget. I think that's where we get stuck, because we are putting ourselves in a box where we can no longer move anywhere. Of course, you don't want your taxes to go to 20+%, but at the same time, we are putting money in these stabilization funds without a plan, which at the same time means we're not spending money for our schools when we are saying, and that was the narrative this year, we need a little time to really get to the point where we are going to be stable. We feel like we are going in that direction. But if we continue to cut, we're basically digging the hole under our feet, and then we are making it more difficult for us to get there. And I think that is what's troubling us, and that seems to be lost in these conversations.
Are you aware of our $35 million obligations?
For the school?
No.
Really? For what?
For the OPEB benefits, the post-employment.
I got to interject here, because this is something nobody ever really gets when I explain it, but this is my last shot, so here we go.
I've been here since 7 o'clock.
252 minutes and counting. Don't say I haven't learned a little math. I think we make a mistake, and this is I don't know, maybe it's a category error or whatever. We are not a self-sufficient entity. We are part of the state. What that means is we have to do what the state wants, but it also means that ultimately we can't necessarily be held responsible for everything that the state does. The state has to take a role. The biggest problem we have right now with funding our schools is enrollment, and the factor that's driving enrollment is Chapter 70. Until that changes, we might struggle. We're probably going to struggle. That's why this fair share amendment that's right now in front of the Supreme Court is going to be crucial to whether next year is a happy year or another annoying year. But we're never going to pay a $35 million OPEB obligation, especially when we're putting in $175,000 a year. That's like saying, oh my God, the earth is going to fall because Granby can't pay it, or we can't spend $200,000 more on the school because we're going to owe $35 million. But if you add the $35 million of the OPEB to the $40 million for the high school we're going to buy in the future, because this one's already falling apart. So, I mean, we're getting out of reality here. We can't pretend that Granby is a limited liability corporation on its own. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of the state. We don't have control. This is why it's such a pain in the neck to run a town. It's like, we're not independent. We can't sit there and pretend that we're a business and that we can have a balance sheet and everything is responsible for what Granby can come in and that the taxpayers can bring in. The taxpayers cannot fund a school on their own. Taxpayers are never going to pay a $35 million OPEB obligation. Taxpayers are never going to be able to pay for a high school unless something changes. To sit there and talk about these things as if they're a reality, and that because Granby happens to be a town, and to say that this is actually this can happen. It can't happen. Without the state and federal government stepping in, these things are not going to happen. So to pretend that they are, same thing with the roads. That one Chris and I went at the other day. Yeah, the state has cut $100 million out of $300 million that normally has been spending on the roads Chapter 90 funds, okay? We can't make that up. If we say we're gonna make that up because we have to, because we're a town, then we miss the point. It can't happen without the state. We're a part of the state. You can't separate us from the state. You can't pretend we're an independent business like a pizza place. We can't go out of business.
Yeah, but those are two different things. And for example, if we do not budget for fixing roads, we know what happens. Potholes are there, they don't get fixed, new roads, that sort of stuff. It doesn't get fixed.
We can't budget money we don't have and we're never gonna have.
Right. But when you're talking about benefits for employees, retired employees, that's a little different situation. If you don't budget that, what happens to the employees?
Okay, it's a state problem.
I died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a statewide problem. It's not a Granby problem.
It is a Granby problem. Every year.
No, it's not. Every single municipality in the state has the same problem. Each community cannot solve it on their own. Therefore, at some point, it's going to go to the state. You can't pretend that we're independent and all solutions rely on us. It just can't happen. We're not independent. People have to realize that if we're actually going to get somewhere. And when you guys meet on June 14th, you're going to have to accept the reality that we are not somebody who can be independent. We can't budget our way out into a $35 million OPEB thing. We can't budget our way into a $40 million high school. We can't budget our way into fixing all the roads that the state's not paying for. It has to come from somewhere else. Doesn't matter how well you budget, there's not enough efficiency. You'd have to be 120% efficient in order to actually get the money to start paying off the things we have. Until people understand that we're not independent and we can't do it ourselves, we're not going to get anywhere. This idea that we can somehow manage our way out of a crisis caused by the state is ridiculous.
No, what it says is that there's only one mechanism where either the state or the town is going to get the money to pay for these things. It's coming from the population. All right. And if you thought that the state was going to step in and suddenly fund all this, you ask, where are they going to get the money? Well, the answer is easy. They're going to get it from the population. And you have what, a couple hundred people in the state legislature voting to increase whatever they want to increase, and it's going to come out of our pockets. So it's really no different except for the mechanism that's used.
You're not on the finance committee for the state.
But
we can't do it. It doesn't. I don't see how it matters. It's not. We're talking about Granby. We run Granby. We do not run the state. Yes, it comes from taxpayers, but that's a whole different question.
So a state legislature is going to sit there and say, okay, we know that the post-employment benefits for all these individuals who are retired state have to be paid for, all right? Are the towns going to pay for it out of their taxes that they raise, or is the state going to pay for it out of the taxes that they raise? And then that's the first question. The second question is, gee, isn't there a difference in what the towns have committed to their benefits? And a lot of it comes from amounts that go through union contracts, we know that. And there are some cities that are very liberal in that regard, and some that are very tight in that regard. So they all have different philosophies about it.
This is academic.
No, it's not. Because
John, it's academic. You have no control over it. There's nothing you can do. You can't budget $3 million into a $35 million thing.
Well, you can sit down and think that if the obligation is there, it has to get paid somehow. How are the choices going to be made?
Because you're not going to do it. We'll be dead by then. We're paying $175,000 a year. How many years is it going to be before we get to $35 million? Not going to happen. I'll be long gone.
So given that we can't solve that problem.
Can I first say, using the word academic as an insult is like, something's academic means good, right? Can we just agree on that?
Can we, it's past 9 o'clock. I mean, if anybody wants to stay, I'm okay, but I know that, there are folks who've been. Can we go back to make sure that we're on the same page as far as what we agreed to last time? So this is going back to the $200,000, and if there is any other suggestions from the Finance Committee with respect to the short term.
And this is not an argument for or against anything, it's a pure question, right? So the meeting that the $200,000 figure was arrived at was scheduled on a Thursday that I had previously booked, so I wasn't there. So as I understand what happened at the meeting, is there was an agreement between the select board and the school committee that the proposed budget for the town, going to the town, would have state minimum plus 305 plus another 200,000 in the
We had
proposed
actually-
budget.
Select Board had directed the town administrator to see what he could find to, above the 300,000
Right.
to contribute, so.
And so then Chris found some extra money, and by finding extra money, but the agreement was that the budget going to the town would then be state minimum plus 505 rather than 305. So that's 200,000. The other 297 that's still remaining is going to be a warrant article asking for stabilization fund money, or what was that part of it, or was that not talked about at that meeting?
No.
That has not been talked about, so we don't know, there's no plan in place right now for the other 297.
No. So, in those ideal circumstances, we would just go with one budget and have 497 included in this
Right.
next fiscal year's budget. Instead of, just like every year, we have this back and forth and all that stuff. But that's what we're trying to understand, where we are, where we stand.
Is your question is, will the Finance Committee support
Yes.
the 505 budget? And the answer is, right now, we don't know, because most of us weren't at that meeting when it came up. So that's going to be a subject for our next meeting.
One or two or three meetings, yeah.
We have several meetings scheduled.
Right, and I guess that I just want to be clear about sort of what the agreement was, and then there's another technical question, right? So the agreement that you had at the meeting was the statement on plus 505. There's been no input from the select board on what to do about the other 297, is that correct?
Not yet.
And is the select board planning to talk about that, or?
Well, we're waiting for them to have their final budget.
So you're waiting for them to have their final budget. So
Yeah,
the
we'll
next step
discuss
would
it.
then be the school committee comes back to both the select board, well, just to the select board, they don't have to come to the finance committee to ask for anything, right? But they go back to the select board
I think in reality, as we
say-
all know, is that I don't think the school can possibly cut another $300,000 where it's gonna go to
Right.
the
So
town.
the plan is to ask for it
town.
as taking out a stabilization
So
fund.
yeah, so we are, that's a good question. We're meeting on Wednesday with the primary purpose of approving the budget. Again, we were going to do it last week after the public hearing. We just postponed it to this Wednesday, waiting for this meeting. There are multiple scenarios.
Right.
Right? So assuming that the conversation that we started last time still holds, so that is 505 over, then we would ask for 297. Again, in my mind, I was hoping that we could come to a point where for this year, we would just have the 297 included in that budget as well, and we would go with that. If it doesn't happen, this budget is the budget that we're going to approve on Wednesday. And we're gonna have to ask the town one way or the other, whether it's the total amount that we present to the town and say this is our school's budget this year, or here's a budget that is not going to be sufficient and therefore we're going to be asking you for additional. Those are at least the two scenarios that we're looking at.
So then, what's the reason for the 200? Is it just that's what Chris found floating around to rechannel?
The
And it
actual
has no
figure
resemblance to
has
anything, So
No,
that's
it's
just,
just money.
it felt like free money, so why not throw it in the budget?
No, that's not the case. The select board had asked Chris, is there any way to look at what's coming in for revenue and stuff like that to what we can predict? And Chris is very, looking at things and all the options, and Chris came back to us and had reported out, looking at the money's coming in and stuff like that. He feels comfortable saying, we, the town, could look at another $200,000.
Okay.
All right, and I think that's fair to say. It's not just numbers that's thrown out there. It's not
So-
money that was hanging around or something like that. He looked at what we could possibly predict for the future that would be coming in.
As it pertains to school budget, it's okay.
Yeah.
Right, so then that's the technical question I have then. So there's a budget that gets presented to the town. It has been my understanding that that budget is the budget prepared by the finance committee and presented to the town, not the budget presented by the select board to the town. Is that a correct understanding?
School committee, school, you guys present your own budget?
Yeah, we have our own.
You present your budget, but the budget that has the state minimum plus 505, that's not put together by the select board, that's put together by the finance committee.
Correct.
We make them,
No.
Don't we make the motion?
No.
No.
Finance committee
No,
does.
I believe it's and that's been my understanding my whole time, that it's the finance committee that actually puts that budget there. And that's why I got confused about what the agreement was, because if the agreement doesn't have the finance committee as the agreement, it's other committees agreeing the finance committee will put state minimum plus 505. And that's an odd agreement, right? I mean, you get together other committees and they say, with this that'd be like us getting to go to select board and deciding what the school committee is going to present to the town, right? And we all had an agreement, then we come to you and say, hey, we all agreed this is what you were gonna present. Would feel weird to you guys, and so that's the part of it that just feels weird to me. Now, like I said, that is neither I think it's a good idea or I think it's a bad idea, but I just wanna be clear that that agreement is not an agreement with the only group that actually presents the budget. And so then that's where I think Rob's right. I mean, I've not been in a single conversation about this $200,000.
In all fairness too, that there were several dates that were thrown out there.
Yeah, and in all fairness, right, I mean,
I feel that I try to accommodate everything possible, and I can't, I brought up here about June 14th, and I got, some I think unprofessional slash to me, but what I'm saying is we looked at trying to do different meetings to get everybody involved, and that particular night was, I think, the most people could have.
We got 3 dates from you guys, is that correct? I don't know, we tried to be.
We were given 3 dates. We said we could make 2 of them, and we could not get a quorum for the third date. And the date was set as the third date that we couldn't get a quorum for.
So, and I get it, trying to schedule this many people for a meeting is tough. I mean, I'm not faulting anybody for that. I just, I wanted to be clear what had been discussed, because like I said, I wasn't there, and so I get it, right? Yes, exactly, right. So.
And on the, just a quick addition, we're talking about 505, 305 is already in the books, so just to emphasize that. So it is.
No, you can't emphasize that.
Why not?
Because we haven't had any discussion at all about the budget.
But no, 305 is already an override. There's.
No.
Rescinded.
305.
It's 305 is.
No.
Necessarily part of your budget.
No, it's not necessarily part of your budget. It was part of your budget for 1 year.
It's traditionally been that way, but that doesn't.
But when you present it to the town as 505, then we should make sure that they understand there's an override component to it. Whether you decide, you agree, kindly give that amount to the schools, folks should not have the impression that there is an additional $505,000 that will be added. Because when we add, let's just assume that you again kindly decide to add $297 on top of it, then it would be $802,000, correct? Whereas we're talking about $497,000 gap compared to what you yourself asked us. That was the question that you asked us. Net plus 305, right? So now, instead of changing the narrative, I think it would help people to understand what is the really impactful portion of that addition to the budget. That's what I'm saying. But that wasn't even the point that I wanted to make. The unpleasant part of this, really unpleasant part of this, is the duty of the superintendent to let everybody know, depending on what is and what is not in the budget, whether or not their positions will be at risk. So just like we've been doing for so many years now, folks have to receive letters that their position may or may not exist after the budget conversation. So that we have to know what that amount is so that the superintendent can prepare for that.
No, we won't know that amount until the town votes on it, though, right?
Legally, we have to. We have
By law,
to.
we have
by
to
law.
notify them by June 1st.
Well, you guys have to, then you have to pink slip people.
Yeah,
Yes, that's
because
what it is.
no matter what's
Unfortunately,
recommended,
but,
the budget won't be approved by June 1st.
Maybe you guys can come up with something for next year where it's less of a problem. I think that was something
Right.
suggested last year.
No, that's fine. But if by then there is a conversation, that's where I'm going with it, that allows us to know what is it. It may not be the case.
No.
It's impossible.
In other words, it's impossible, because if the town decided they wanted to vote state minimum plus $8 billion, but as of June 1st, you still don't have a budget, right?
You will have no budget until June 11th.
Right.
That's the earliest you can have a budget.
And so.
And our current budget goes till June 30th, but legally we have to let everybody know.
So, I mean, you're
on
stuck
June
with that
1st.
problem.
That won't
You're stuck
happen.
with that problem no
That
matter
won't
what
happen.
the recommendation comes
Well, I
out.
mean,
And it's not fun, I get it.
Have you ever been to pink slip? Yeah, but like this, I'll give you an example. This is what happened in East Long Meadow this year.
Did you enjoy it?
I didn't say enjoyed it.
That's exactly, yeah. I know.
Nobody enjoys it, but it's like, I don't think I can solve that problem.
This is the first time
Hey,
305, the override is not part of the
you guys
town
enjoy it?
parameter.
No, John's point is right, that the 305, so state minimum is required minimum. The 305 was an override by the town partly for schools, partly for anything. Mark said, turns out it was only legally binding to be spent on that purpose for 1 year. So that's the legally binding, there's nothing legally binding on it. So when you, and I think John was objecting to Emery's like, it's guaranteed, not automatic. No, it's not. But the Finance Committee, my entire time here, we've never talked about not doing the 305, right? And that hasn't been a discussion, but there's an important distinction between it's a requirement and it's just something we traditionally do. So
I think what they're asking, so that shouldn't be part of their budget, so if they have to make
That's
cuts
additional.
according to that, that's addition, that's not part of their budget, that's $305,000.
Additional notices is what we're saying.
Right.
$305,000.
I guess
is a
I'm
lot.
confused about the notices. What are the notices on the basis of? It's not based on your guess about the budget, is it, or is it?
It's based on 497,000. It's not
No, but
going
how
to
do
be
you
based on
decide what your budget
497
is on
plus
June
305.
Well, we are going by, so far,
Yeah.
until this year, it's net school spending plus 305, which,
And that on June 1st is enough to decide who has to be pink slipped or not?
no, it's just basically tells us that between what we.
305 is
that This is
additional,
the minimum
you're
we're gonna
saying.
get, that's the
Oh, it's
assumption.
because you know that is the minimum you
Right,
get.
and whatever the gap
But
is,
that's the
that
oddity.
is.
You don't know it's the minimum you get.
Slip the difference.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
but I'm just saying, you don't know it's the minimum you
Yes.
get until the town votes on it
Exactly.
technically.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly, and so if the town.
If the town voted on it, then you get pink slip more. But so why can't you, I mean, how does the rule on what you said is your minimum?
Look,
get set?
honestly, beyond all that,
Yeah.
I think the big effect is this. Whether or not, for the first time that I can remember, we will be able to go with that one budget and say, we all agree on this. You're absolutely correct that it is up to the town at the end of the day to vote it up or down. The question is whether or not we will be able to tell the town, this is the school's budget, and we all agreed on it. Whatever that number is.
Right.
That's what I'm getting
Well,
to.
what you're thinking gonna be if the last 297 is coming out of stabilization funds? I mean, that, which is probably the most likely source.
If, actually,
I mean, you're gonna, you would have,
So-
I would think you would have to think so at that point in time.
well, that may be the case, and I honestly don't know the answer, I don't have all the scenarios. But I would imagine that there are, as you guys have been telling us, there are multiple ways of addressing any gap. We always talked about stabilization and override as two possibilities. There is also the free cash that we always vote in May before, before we can even do anything related to the budgets. So I'm assuming that's that, but that's why we were talking about this short term. Short-term funding sources are known to us. We're not gonna be able to, create additional revenue. So it's either, stabilization, free cash, or, override. Those are the short-term things. What I'm asking is, and you may be right, that at the end of the day, it may go there and we have to ask for a particular source. Whether or not we will be able to, as these three committees, say, this is the budget that we agreed to. We had our conversations, and for this year, we agreed on this budget. That's what I'm asking.
Before I comment on that, something you said made me think of another question. Are you planning on supporting the use of the free cash for replacing the roof? That comes up at the May special town meeting.
So that's another thing that can be and probably should be discussed. I
Well-
don't know whether or not you guys had a conversation. I know that at your last meeting, you had some conversation regarding that. So we're looking at our stabilization funds. We're saying that they're going down, but then at the same time, we're saying that, we're gonna take all that amount and then we're gonna spend in its entirety. And I don't know that we have the final bids or final concrete numbers around the roof project. But let's just assume it's whatever free cash comes in, it's the same thing. Do we really want to do that? Or do we want to take advantage of some of the very low rates out there, at least to borrow part of it? And then we can deposit rest of it into the stabilization fund that we're trying
Are you gonna recommend against the
Why
roof?
does that question have to be answered first before we can answer
For,
Emery's
for,
question?
for this reason, the question really to you is, are you against putting on the roof?
Against putting on the roof?
Yeah.
No, we need,
Okay.
we're gonna need the roof, yeah.
The warrant article on the May 19th meeting is, the warrant article
Yeah.
says that money is going to come from free cash to pay for a school roof. Other warrant articles, there are other warrant articles which list on the warrant article the source of the funds to pay for articles. For a lot of the articles, matter of fact, for most of the articles, it doesn't give a specific funding source in the warrant article. Specific funding source is given in the motion.
Right.
There's a difference. When it says it on the warrant article, that can't be changed. So the options at town meeting are going to be either to put on a roof and spend the money from stabilization fund, or not put on a roof. I'm sorry, from free cash. So either put on the roof and pay for it from free cash, or not put on a roof. I think those are the only two options.
We had no input to what that
Yeah.
source could be. We had no conversations around that. So we weren't able to have this conversation, I guess, before that was put on the warrant. And I don't know. So this question. We always talk about free cash disappearing for one fiscal year if we don't do something with it by 6/30, right? By the end of the June 30th.
But we usually take stuff that we're not using and put it in stabilization
We
funds.
do, but
That's the
this time,
purpose of
If we
that.
say it's gonna be spent for a particular project, and that project is not even in sight yet, what happens to that free cash? Are we gonna deposit it somewhere so it doesn't disappear for one fiscal year, or
No.
how does it remain
No.
alive, in other words, for the project?
If we vote to spend free cash on this project for next year, then that money is earmarked for that project. So on July 1st, that money is gone off the books because it's earmarked to be spent on the project, just like all the money for the town budget is earmarked. So that if we then decide not to do the roof next year, unless we have another special kind of process to take the money back from the warrant, I don't think it has any chance at all making it a free cash for the following year.
Okay, so what you're saying is that because
The money will disappear for a
dedicated
year.
For a project, it will not disappear it will not be taken away, it will be available for that particular project, because it's earmarked
Right. But not available for other things.
for other things.
Yeah.
If the article fails, it's an entirely different story.
So it kind of feels as though we've been backed into a corner, because we
just
didn't
don't
have
have
any
any say.
conversation, we had no say in this whatsoever.
And I'm glad
We-
that you're mentioning it, because I
We're
didn't even know.
$497,000 in a gap with our budget, and we're gonna take $1.4 million out of free cash to put on a roof.
This came up at our last meeting.
It
Because actually, I spoke to it because I brought it up and actually made the statement that I've had firsthand knowledge that there's parents that were really mad that sports were getting postponed because games, and because the roof was leaking. They were
No, we're
upset.
not
No, we're
saying
not
that,
against-
we're not
again,
against
that's- we
putting on the
agree with
roof.
that.
No, I'm
We're-
not saying I'm against it. I wasn't implying that.
Totally not. What we're taking issue with is,
Is spending that $1.4 million to fix the roof and to fix the ventilation system and to put on skylights.
Yes.
Yes, that's what you're taking issue with, is that you don't want that to happen? Well, I would like to see that happen.
that's not at all what we're saying.
No,
That's
the-
not
the-
at
the-
all
the-
what we're
The
saying.
point is why can't we borrow the 1.4 million versus?
Or
spending it?
not
par- or
even,
parts of it. It
not
doesn't have to
even
be
the
one
whole
point.
thing.
Makes no sense.
Parts of it. How does that not make sense?
If you have money to put
Depleting free
The-
cash
the
or
whole school is
stabilization.
depleting in my mind and in my eyes. And we have to start spending some money on a roof. I mean,
We're gonna put a roof on an empty building is the concern, because if we're forced into a situation where we have to make the cuts that we're looking at, I can't name a parent who won't be pulling their kids out of the school system.
Now who sounds alarmist and despairing? When I say things like that, I get yelled at.
What do you
There
want
will
me
be
to say?
students in the high school. Let's
I'll be the first
positive.
one to go.
it makes no sense.
No, but
If you're gonna let the roof leak,
No, we want to get the roof fixed, but we can't understand, it just doesn't,
you want, you
objection
just,
to that.
okay, no objections to that.
I
yeah.
think it's the funding source, Steve.
The funding.
that
Yeah, it's
we're
the
talking
just
about.
how we're gonna
Otherwise, there's
pay
no
for it.
objection
okay,
to
so
that.
what,
That's- We're all on the same
but
page
you
on
gotta
that.
remember though, that $1.4 million, that's something the town's gotta vote on what to do with that money regardless. So even if the town said, know what, we don't wanna put the roof on, doesn't mean that the school's gonna get $300,000 of that 1.4.
Right.
This town still has to say, yes, we'll give you that money.
I mean, I'll be honest, this is a nice thing. It's nice not to be the villain in this piece, because we also didn't.
We're still the villain.
Yeah, no, okay, I'll still be that.
It would have been nice to have the conversation before the warrant
I'm
article
happy
ended up
if you guys had had the
on
conversation with whoever
town
put the
floor.
warrant article on, but I guess I would
We
just say,
didn't
yeah, I didn't draft this warrant article either, right? That's their fault. That's my point, it's them. So,
It really is.
but in my mind, the fact that there's been this roof project that's been lingering around for a long time, and there happens to be enough money to just get this project done, is something that I look at and I say, wow, we can get it done. We don't have to argue about borrowing, we don't have to do all that. And I get you've got other, but there are other things in town, but just sort of the coincidence of the cost of getting this all fixed and that amount sitting there. This is like one of those dream come true moments where you hit the lottery right when you have the bill. And so,
I guess,
Well, it's
to
my
go
night-
back,
yeah.
to go back what everyone's saying
it's your
before.
nightmare to put a roof on?
No, I think the challenge is, I think, what
Yeah.
you're saying, if we were not having the budget conversation
Right.
on the side, what you're saying may be correct.
Yeah.
And, there would still be a school of thought that would say, hey, let's just look at the borrowing rates, because there are some pretty good rates out there. But let's just put that aside. I think the concern is becoming, Jim, that now we're talking about 1.4, and then we're talking about the budget. And I can guarantee you the conversation at the town meeting is gonna be, you guys are taking $2 million, or whatever the round up number is gonna be, from the town. And that was, there's a practical side, a financial
So-
side, and the mental side, perception side to all these conversations.
That argument hinges though on, and this may be true, right? People don't get the difference between borrowing and spending free cash. In other words, we're spending the 1.4, and then if we spend the money in the school system, we're still spending the same 2 million. And so if the argument is people in town will think borrowing money is less of a drag on the town than just spending this free cash, I hear what you're saying. But in the end, it's the same amount getting spent.
Actually, more getting spent when you borrow it.
Well, more gets spent if you borrow, because people don't
Where's
ever
the money
discount the
gonna
borrowing
come
back.
from for the roof?
Yeah.
Where do you picture the money coming from for the roof?
Well, if you borrow part of it, the rest of it can come from free cash, can come from stabilization. It's up to you guys to.
It comes
But-
from free cash?
Just,
Yeah, I mean,
You just spending $1.4 million out of free, I'm not sure why you're surprised. Is that you surprised because I mentioned free cash?
First of all, I was surprised that we had 1.4 million in free cash this year.
Well, we shouldn't be, because it wasn't, we do have a pretty healthy.
being between
Yeah, we have pretty,
five
except
We
for
have-
2006,
we
we're
have
still pretty healthy.
one of the biggest complaints that I hear from people in the town is that we don't maintain our buildings. The money we spend, the money we put towards buildings, we don't maintain them. Here's a chance for us to.
No objection to that. I think we're confusing two things.
No, and I want to get back
Yeah.
to what you
Yeah.
originally had said before, was that I think you're looking for, hey, you know what, it became to, are you going to support this? Well, I think Emery was looking for, are you going to support an override? Or are you going to support taking $297,000 out of stabilization fund for the fund, for the school? I mean, is that,
Whatever, exactly,
What you
whatever
want
the
support
source
from the
is, are we
different
going
towns?
to say, this is what we believe the school budget should be? At the end of the day, if we want to really forget about free cash stabilization, this and that, it's a funding matter, correct? So, are we going to be able to say that this is the school budget we are supporting? That is my question. The roof conversation is a separate conversation. I'm only concerned about that because it affects the other side of the conversation, the budget conversation. But you're absolutely correct that what I'm trying to understand is whether or not we will be able to say this is the budget we collectively say should be the school's budget. I don't know if you told us that you're gonna have more meetings to decide. I don't know when we're gonna be able to.
You guys haven't even signed up on the budget. You want us to sign off on it?
No, we're not, you just told us that you can't even sign off on it, the town's gonna sign off on it.
I'm just
No,
trying to
excuse-
understand
excuse
whether or
me.
not.
You want the finance committee to say that they're supporting your budget before you say, this is the budget. you
Okay,
want.
that's fair. So, then we're gonna vote for it on Wednesday.
Right.
Then we can have this conversation. Are we going to have that conversation or not? Is it still a possibility? Should we, do you need anything from us? Because no matter what we say, at the end of the day, if we are able to say as the three committees that we agreed this is the school budget for this year, I think it would bode well for what we're trying to do.
I hear
Or
what you're
we-
saying, but I think partially, and this is what I'm saying, right? You guys don't have a formal budget yet
We do.
that
If
you've
it-
passed.
that we're
No,
gonna-
that we did not approve.
Right, you don't have an approved
Yeah.
budget yet.
Hang on a second. When we vote on Wednesday, it's a formality. The numbers that we've given you tonight, those are our final numbers.
Yeah, we're gonna vote.
And the only
what-
reason
So
why
you're
we
voting on
didn't
that.
vote,
Yeah.
Okay.
it was because we
Voting
wanted
on
to
that.
wait for
That's
this
fine.
one last meeting.
I can live with, I mean, that's fine
Yeah.
then. So
That's
then,
fine. But,
we're
you know,
seeing
the
numbers
point that you're
now.
making is
Then the
fair.
question is, the select board will have to decide, I think individually, whether they all support whatever funding sources and spending to vote, right? We have to decide on a budget that we're presenting to town with these sorts of things. These are all conversations that have to happen, and so then, yeah, it's possible all three committees all arrive at the same. It's also possible we agree in part and disagree in part.
Well, individuals.
And they're all individuals, and I guess that's the, this is my plea of like, we just get to the point where we all have the conversations and then we realize reasonable people can disagree and that's okay, that, support this part, don't support this part, that's not some sort of a big statement, but I think the school saying, here's what we feel our budget needs to be, right? That's the first step, and then the finance committee has to sit down and figure out, okay, well, what are the funding sources, how are we gonna do this, these sorts of things. We haven't had that conversation, because this is the first time I've heard that number, the 497 tonight. It was bigger the last time I heard the number, and so now it's a smaller number, and as I said earlier, right, that's great, it's great that it's a smaller number we're talking about, rather than the bigger number. Then there was the other meeting where the Board of Selectmen and you all found this $200,000 floating around. I don't know where that came from still. That's something- No, I know, Chris found it, right, and I don't know where that came from or what that
Although we're
discussion
grateful
was
for
all
it.
about. That's great,
Yeah.
and so, but it's hard for us to comment even on that portion of it without actually knowing, well, what were the details there. So I hear what you're saying. You would love it if everybody agreed, but in order to get everybody agreeing, we all have to figure out what we're all talking about first.
Maybe it's instructive, and this may be the last thing we do to wrap up, if the selectman could explain the reasoning behind the warrant article being out of free cash as opposed to bonding.
I think, in a discussion with Chris, he thought that we had the money now to pay for it. Why borrow it? Why not just pay for it? We have it to pay for it. So my feeling is too, why are we gonna borrow $8 million, I'm sorry, even if we borrow a portion, say we borrowed $750,000, we borrowed half of it. Why should we pay interest on something that we don't need to? And if we took that loan out borrowed it for 5 years, we're paying interest for 5 years. Even if we found some generous person to give it to us for 2%, 2% and $750,000 for 5 years. Why spend it? That's just like that's like taking money out of our stabilization fund.
Okay.
And then the other question, you guys may not have talked about it, but I gather you do support the $200,000, sort of the found money sort of thing. What about the other 297? Have you guys talked about the other 297 at all as a board of selectmen?
We haven't. I think that's, I think you talked about.
Right.
As a board, it's one thing. As a personal opinion, as someone supports it, it's something different. It's to say, and I'm just throwing this out there to say, well, Steve and Glenn supported, but Mark don't.
Right.
It's not to say the select board didn't. We don't want people to say, well, the select board doesn't support it. This, we're individuals as well.
Yes.
And and I think as we kind of got to look at that is how you support something is not just as a board, but also as a,
The board has no formal vote on the 297 thing, right?
No.
That just, guys would just be voting on whatever is the thing presented to town, is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean,
In order to go to the town with a cohesive budget.
Right.
it would be, right, from some, I think from Emory, from the school committee, it'd be much, I think, easier if you have everybody that's sitting up in that front of that gym all thinking the same thing or feeling the same thing, because that's what people are looking for sometimes, for guidance and things like that, so.
Or at least voting the same way.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Oh, no, that's when you raise your car.
And I'll
Doesn't matter what
I've
you
seen
think
it
of.
happen before, and I've seen it happen, sort of happen, see it happen again. People look up at that table before they vote to see how someone's gonna vote.
It's nice to remove as much uncertainty as we can, but at the end of the day, it's not our call. It's the town's
It's not our
call.
money.
Yes, that is.
I mean, it is my money, part of my money.
But a lot of those folks look to town leadership for the recommendations.
And that's exactly the point I make, when people actually look up at there and see how someone votes before they vote.
And there's a lot of influence in that regard. And I think we all know that. So that's why Emery was asking the simple question
Well,
of,
we don't know till we actually see a budget. Yeah.
so is there some way for us to have a discussion prior to May 14th? Or how you guys decide?
We actually
You guys go
have
after?
probably,
I suspect either the week of May 21st or May 21st, we'll have to have budget figures that go to print. The booklet that's handed out to all townspeople who want to come get one is to go to print probably 2 to 3 weeks before the second town meeting, for the June 11th town meeting. So we've got a lot of stuff that's got to get done by that time, but it'll be that's kind of the drop dead deadline because stuff has to get sent to a printer. So
What is that date again, John? 21st?
either May 21st or the week of May 21st.
But then, June 14th.
June
We can-
14th is
we can start the
I'm sorry,
conversation.
June 11th. June 11th is the town meeting that the budget will be discussed at.
But then I'm already thinking, when we start conversations about, longer term, more strategic goals.
Well,
I think that we're going to start, that was after the town meeting.
That's after the town meeting.
Yep.
That's why I picked that date. And as it is, we have scheduled meetings for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Yeah, we have scheduled meetings for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of this week.
This week?
Yeah.
Well, because
And
Monday is town meeting.
And Monday is town meeting, yeah.
I mean, Monday, Tuesday.
Yeah. And we'll probably schedule meetings for Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday of next week. We don't know yet. We haven't checked to see who's available next week.
This week and next week, you will?
We'll schedule meetings, I think, every day.
John likes to schedule meetings.
Because it is hard.
Oh, that's why.
It is hard very long ahead of time to get a quorum together. And on some days, it's really kind of impossible to get a quorum together because of previous commitments that people have. So we have meetings scheduled for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of this week. And we will have meetings scheduled for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of next week. But we won't know until the afternoon, probably, of those days, whether or not we're going to have the meeting, though I'm pretty sure we have a quorum for tomorrow. And you can't do it, huh? You can't?
Yes.
Can you make tomorrow, Scott?
Yes.
Yeah, Wednesday, Thursday.
And Bob? So we'll have a meeting tomorrow to have some discussion about it, and then probably Wednesday or Thursday, we'll be able to get 4 or 5 of us together, and then we'll have more intensive discussions. And then we don't have to make a decision then, but probably the following week we would want to make one. And, we'll certainly, I can call Cheryl, I can call you, whoever you want, and let you know what the status of when we're going to actually have the meetings. That's not a problem. Yeah.
Great.
Cheryl then?
Call you, Cheryl?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm going to be very busy
Yeah.
this week.
Okay, I'll call you.
Yeah, I just want to take a minute. I know amongst all of us meeting here, I know we kind of gave shots here or there, a little back and forth, but I thought this was a great meeting. And I think myself, as not someone who sits on the select board, but a resident of Granby, to see all of us come together and sit here and talk about things that affects the whole town, I think it's great. I think we had a great conversation, and we talked about a lot of stuff. I think we made headway.
I'd certainly like to echo that, and our feeling, anybody who's watched finance committee meetings know that we have some pretty good arguments. We look at both sides of the questions, and we argue both sides of the questions, and that's the way, that's our method of making sure that we've discovered what's happening on any of the issues. But we recognize that everybody has roles as individuals, everybody has roles as members of the board that they're on. There are sort of obligations to be true to what the mission of your particular organization is, and the fact that there are disagreements